Thank you for joining us for Ask the Expert Educator Edition, ADHD and Executive Functioning by Kristin Sinclair. This webinar begins with the session already in progress.
That internal guidance, so to speak. So it's like having an orchestra without a conductor in place. And if you can kind of imagine what that would be like, everyone would be kind of warming up differently, playing different volumes, playing different tunes, playing different speeds. And kind of off, it kind of sounds like a jumbled mess. There's no harmony. We're not in sync. But what that conductor does, or that internal person or control kind of does, is pull it all together so that we're all playing the same tempo, the same volume, the same tune, and it sounds like a beautiful piece of music. Everything kind of works hand in hand. And that is kind of the uh, internal control, or best way to kind of explain how we regulate behavior. So with that said, our students with ADHD are kind of missing that. And they need that as an external person to help remediate that deficit. So we need more of those external controls. And we often think of, especially as students get older, is, well, kids should be able to do that by now. I think especially when we jump into upper elementary school and into middle school, is that there's a lot of conversations that I have with teachers of, well, in middle school we do this. But we also have to think about, sometimes our students with ADHD are lagging in that maturity with their peers. But that also, again, goes in line with the inability to have that internal control to regulate those behaviors. So we need to put some structures in place, whether it be in our classroom or through transitions, to help provide that rudder to kind of get them through the waters of their day-to-day activities. So we think about things that they're strongly influenced by the structures and the conditions of the immediate environment, and that we need to make sure that we're putting some rewards to help guide that behavior. So when we look at some of the areas that the executive functioning affects, is we look at communication, we look at pragmatics and social interactions, we look at processing and reasoning. These are all just kind of bucket areas. Problem solving and learning, and memory being kind of the big areas where that impacts our students typically diagnosed with ADHD. So if we kind of break that down a minute before we kind of get into some strategies of how do we align strategies that work on these deficit areas to ensure that they have those supports and structures, looking at that external control that we can kind of help put in place for them to be successful. So if we look at communication difficulties, these are some of the areas that some of our students struggle with. Now, I think it's important to keep in mind that a lot of the strategies that we're going to talk about in just a minute here are good, but they might not work for all students. You're going to have to look at what specific deficits to make sure that we're aligning the appropriate intervention or strategy to that student's deficit area. Because just because it doesn't come as a toolbox altogether of saying, here's your diagnosis with ADHD, so here are the things that you're going to put in place. It really isn't going to depend on the individual student and the severity and the type of deficits that they have tied to their diagnosis of ADHD. So with that said, there are some areas with communication that could be affected by an individual you're thinking about, or some students that you have in your classrooms now. Disorganized conversation, I think of that as kind of having those squirrel moments where we're talking about one thing and we're on a particular topic, and then all of a sudden we've added in kind of a sidebar something, and don't forget this, and we're kind of popping all off the page. So to the audience or to whomever the child is speaking to, it's hard to follow their conversational thought because it doesn't go in a logical sequence. They struggle with, because their thought process is like that, and that's what their communication is, that honestly on the other end of kind of what their receptive communication and their understanding level, sometimes it can be difficult with reading and just in conversation themselves and being part of a conversation. it's difficult for them to be able to tease out the main idea of really what's kind of the gist of this conversation or the gist of this of what they're reading, because that's what they struggle with, again, when they have conversations or when they're sharing their acquired knowledge. They can be very impulsive, inattentive, and just struggle with that initiation of skills or initiation into activities. So with pragmatics and social social interaction, they could have difficulties in any one of those areas or all of those areas listed. So the ability to take someone else's perspective. This can be very difficult when trying to have peer relationships, because they only see it as their way. And so that can be very difficult when, especially in schools nowadays, we're asking, because of the rigor of the curriculum, for them to be more collaboratively and or to work in more collaborative groups and do more activities out of isolation. So that can be very, very difficult with getting along with and finding their space, so to speak. Processing and reasoning. This again, with the way curriculum has changed over the years with Common Core or whatever your state is currently using along those lines, that it's gotten away from the very concrete. Obviously, we have to have very concrete foundational knowledge and be able to answer those questions. But now our kids are really asked to kind of step it up, and it's really more about the reasoning and the application of those things. So that can be very difficult, kind of thinking outside the black and white, being able to draw conclusions, make inferences, evaluative type responses to things, that it's getting them to think differently. And that can be very, very difficult to kind of not be kind of structured in their responses. With problem solving and learning, again, just being able to come up with multiple solutions, especially, again, working in collaborative groups, the ability to accept and be open-minded to other opportunities or other opinions of others working in their group. So being able to generate multiple solutions as opposed to, well, this is the answer and this is the way it is. So being able to kind of reflect on and tweak and adjust based on new information and new data can be very, very difficult. Carrying out instructions or tasks to completion can be difficult for multiple reasons. Sometimes, again, being able to process all the steps that need to be taken can be overwhelming, and so they have a difficult time initiating tasks. So you'll also see with these bucket areas, sometimes our buckets kind of bleed into each other. But not only is it difficult for them to carry out the instructions, but sometimes we forget all the steps that need to be done. So it's not that they're being non-compliant, it's they're not quite sure what leads into next or what they're supposed to do because they can't remember it all. So being able to retain that information. And then lastly, kind of looking at memory. So being, again, retaining information long enough to complete those tasks. So again, talking about how those buckets kind of bleed together. Accomplishing tasks and being on time. Sometimes, again, processing speeds are a little bit slower. So it takes a little bit of time to process what are we supposed to do, then actually getting into the work and sustaining task in order to complete it. So sometimes pacing can be a real difficult. By the time we actually get started, it's time to transition into the next activity or the task. So that can be really, really, really difficult. So keeping those kind of things in mind, we want to think about, well, what does it look like in school? You know, how do all those bucket areas affect what students are asked to do on a day-to-day basis in schools today? So we kind of look at deficits in all of these areas being really affected. The organization, the importance of organization, especially as kids get older and we're asking them to transition between multiple teachers throughout a school day. Shifting attention, you know, the integration of technology in schools. So it's not, you know, just using multiple different modes of instruction between online platforms or flipped classrooms or different stations that we have set up in the classroom, again, utilizing collaborative work groups, all of those kind of things can be really difficult for our students to know what to block out, because it's oftentimes not that our students aren't paying attention, it's our students are paying attention to absolutely everything. So it's overstimulating. So all of those things are kind of things that we see affected in schools. So if we break it down by kind of the content areas, you can see that obviously those executive functioning deficits could impact reading in their ability to plan, recall, use decoding strategies, making inferences, all of those kind of higher level type reading skills can be impacted. And then of course into their writing skills. And then when we look into math.
Just one moment. I think Ms. Sinclair's microphone has just lost its sound for one moment, and she will be right back with you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Please continue.
Oh, good. Thank you. Sorry. So then what you can see in written expression and how that continues on, again, the organization. So if you think about how students are struggling in reading, we can definitely see how that relays into their written expression skills as well. Written expression tends to be a little bit harder because it's not only getting the orthographic representation and the phonological pieces down pat, but then also kind of knowing what you're going to say and how you're going to formulate that. So it gets to be a little bit more complicated with writing. Oftentimes, many of our students struggle in writing. And then you also have kind of how those executive functions affect math difficulties. So maintaining an idea, organizing their thoughts, understanding the strategy and applying those strategies. So you see those memorization skills, organization skills kind of throughout all of these. And then lastly, before we kind of get into, now we know kind of some of the areas it falls into, but then how do we align some strategies to it, is looking at study skills, which go across the board, across all content areas. We look at their organization of their desk or the backpack. Sometimes you can open up some of those things, and despite even sometimes having some good organizational strategies in place, sometimes we still find things from forever ago. I was helping a teacher not too long ago, setting up an organizational, just a check-in with a student to make sure that we were going through the locker once a week just to clean things out, and managed to find a picture form from like months prior of going, how did we miss this, considering we were already on the cleanup of the locker? It just kind of magically appeared from somewhere. It's like that missing sock in the laundry. Completing homework can be difficult. And the thing with completing homework is that oftentimes we don't realize how many steps there truly are in homework. There's about 12 steps if you actually break it down to homework completion. So it's not just our kids aren't turning in the homework, it's what step in that process is where the breakdown is happening. So sometimes we have to dig a little bit deeper below the surface to determine what exactly is causing the student to struggle in that task or in that area. And then just even interpreting things, and not only just interpreting assignments correctly, but interpreting conversations or interpreting just kind of social interactions that are happening that can be difficult for our kiddos. So what we have to do as teachers is we have to know and understand what ADHD is. We're not diagnosing ADHD. That's definitely in the medical arena, but it does have an educational impact. So we have to have an educational treatment plan, so to speak. We have to be able to describe those classroom behaviors that are limiting their access to the general curriculum. And then in saying that, then also what remedies are we putting in place? What structures are we putting in place to act as that external control? Because they don't have the internal ability to do it on their own at this point. And sometimes those external controls have to stay in place and have to be taught. So if we think about that gradual release model, we have to spend an awful lot of time in that I do phase of teaching how to use that over and over and over again. So just because we say, or we just put something in place, doesn't mean that the student is going to utilize that strategy or that structure appropriately without having explicit instruction to do so. So that is really the key with any of these strategies that we'll talk about in just a second. And then we also want to look at what behavioral interventions. So it's not only just about the classroom structures or some of the accommodations that we could put in place, but also looking at some interventions that we might need on the behavioral front as well, some classroom management structures as well. So we want to kind of think about it from a cognitive perspective, so to speak, because what executive functioning means is it's really looking at a set of cognitive processes that enable us to do these things. It enables us to get started, right? Taking that initiative, right? The directions were given. This is what we're to do. I know I need to break it down into, these chunks in order to get the task done. Being able to direct our attention despite other things that might be happening within our classroom, and being able to then to sustain focus on that given task. Being able to organize multiple materials, right? And being able to kind of juggle all the things that we need to accomplish throughout the day. Being able to kind of process information within our heads, but also kind of then being able to work collaboratively with a group. So being able to switch from one task to another, or control our emotions and impact, any of those kind of things that helps us work collaboratively with others. So we're going to break it down when we're looking at those cognitive perspectives. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the 6 aspects of executive functioning, and then we'll align the strategies that kind of go along to help support that. So the first one that we're going to look at is really the ability for students to regulate their actions. So we might have students that struggle with that they just very impulsive, jump to conclusions, say things without thinking about how that would impact or affect the other person that it's being said in front of or to, unaware really of the impact of their behavior has on anyone else. So those kind of things definitely affect the social aspect, but then also from an instructional aspect, difficulty, those are the kids that just do things without really listening or processing the directions. So we could be passing out materials and giving the directions at the same time, and the student's already done by the time we get to the directions, but might not have done it correctly because they needed the directions or to kind of hear how we were doing the assignment prior to jumping right in. And then there are some students that sometimes providing corrective feedback can be very difficult and very ill received, because it takes so much mental effort for them to get their ideas and thoughts or to do the work that was asked of them, that when sitting down in a conference, whether it be writing or kind of just going through their work and talking through it or helping them through it, they get very defensive and upset because they've tried their best, and they think that is the best work and I did what you asked me to do, and they aren't as receptive to that corrective feedback. So a couple of things on this before getting into some other ones as well, but some suggestions in passing materials out. I know we're all pressed for time during the school day, so one suggestion would be is giving the directions first before passing out the materials, so that way they can truly process through what it is that we're asking them to do. Or again, if we're selective in where we're passing materials out. So again, if it's one particular student, do we start on the other side of the room and pass those materials out and not get to that row until after the directions are given? If it's something that if we pass the materials out as we're giving directions, is there also a visual like checklist of what needs to be done that could be provided to that student or written on the board. So that way, even if they missed the directions orally that were given, that they also have something to pair that to written wise to kind of help them go through to make sure that they've done the task that's being asked. The other thing that's good in kind of helping to regulate actions are the use of rubrics can be really, really good, especially when we're talking about students not being very receptive to corrective feedback, is to go back and use the rubric. So then it's not you saying that the work isn't up to par, but as per the rubric that we have gone over explicitly beforehand, these were the things that were being looked for. Do we have these things? Are we matching these things up? So it'll be very important to have a very clear and concise rubric that you're utilizing, that the students understand what those expectations are prior to beginning those assignments. And sometimes that takes or helps to regulate those actions, is having some of those structures in place. The next one is looking at focusing attention or shifting attention. We do many things throughout the school day that we're asking students to transition from activity to activity. And that doesn't necessarily mean subject area or big movements from room to room, but just even could be from morning work and pull out a new worksheet to work on this. Could be something as simple as that when we're talking about shifting attention. The difficult part with this is sometimes our students are very easily distracted by the environment. So it can be difficult to control all the things happening in the environment, but some of the things that we can put in place is, where are our students seated in the classroom? Are we having them seated away from the door or away from the windows if that's where all the action is happening, or away from, if we have a lot of action happening on our classroom going towards the pencil sharpener, or as we're switching groups and stations, that we're always passing by that student's desk. We just want to look for a place in the room that would limit some of those distractions or a lot of movement around that individual student's desk. And that doesn't always necessarily mean, sometimes when we talk about preferential seating, the common thought process is that it means sitting up front. And that doesn't necessarily reign true. It's really looking at the flow pattern of movement happening in your classroom. So where is there less movement happening? But that also provides you some proximity ability as well. So sometimes if we're being the ones as the adults and teachers in the classroom, monitoring and providing that support, do we have access to that student if we need to have that proximity control in certain activities throughout the day? So again, looking at your room arrangement as being something to really help with sustaining or paying attention, helping with those attention to tasks, is eliminating some of those challenges. But we can also see how not being able to pay attention to a task or sustain focus for long periods of time could affect other areas, particularly comprehension, right? If our students aren't able to maintain focus throughout a paragraph or a passage or whatever it is they're reading, it's going to fragment their understanding of that given piece. So we'll talk about some other strategies for that one in just a minute. Getting started can be a huge thing. And when we look at what we have to pack in during a school day, that can be really hard to do because there's a lot going on. So we have to move at a quick pace. So if there's such a long delay before they actually get started, and oftentimes it's because they're still processing what's being said or being asked of them. So they're trying to get it going, but it appears that the difficulty for them to kind of initiate work tasks or generating ideas or beginning work. So all of those can be areas of struggle that we'll talk about, some organizational strategies that we can help put in place for kiddos. And then working memory, being able to remember and follow verbal directions, being able to retain information in order to complete a task, whether that be any kind of academic task, whether that be a writing prompt or steps in a math problem, but being able to utilize what strategies and routines do we have in place. So that could be the use of mnemonic strategies. It could be written, if we have just written or tasks broken down into written steps that we can provide them as a reminder. So I think it's important to pair those verbals with something written down pat. So that way we don't have to continue to flood their cognitive space with the verbal over and over and over again, that we can also pair it with what's written. Sometimes we over communicate. And then that goes into the organization and the work and schoolwork stuff. So difficulty organizing their materials. It looks like a hurricane has gone off in some of the lockers I've seen over the years. Just so much stuff that we just don't know where anything is. We don't have an organizational system to things. Managing and pacing time. That's one that really needs to be explicitly taught, and I've really worked with many teachers over the last several years of teaching kids how to pace themselves. So it starts off small, and it might start off with a workbook activity or a couple math problems of saying, this should take you about 5 minutes to complete these 3 problems. I'm going to check in with you in 2.5 minutes to see where you are, but to help shape what pacing looks like, because they really truly don't know. If we just give them the end time and say you need to be done with this in 10 minutes, and we're not helping them to monitor that and to kind of pace them through that, it's not just going to internally happen. We have to help them learn how to pace. And then looking at self-monitoring skills. This kind of goes along with that accepting corrective feedback can be really difficult, is reviewing their work, going through and checking for errors, understanding that rough draft isn't the final draft kind of thing. So this piece with the self-monitoring can be very helpful with things like checklists or rubrics to kind of help them look through how well they're doing and are they meeting all the requirements, so it doesn't become a battle of the adult and the student. And then this last one is not listed when we're looking at the executive function and deficits within the DSM, but it's definitely one that is heavily impacted by with our students, is that we see a lot of students struggle with being able to control their own emotions. So those are kids that go from like 0 to 60 in like 3 seconds flat over something silly. It could be, he took my pencil, and we've just our reaction as a student is really inappropriately aligned to what actually occurred, that we've kind of blown up and made a big deal out of something so small. So we have to work with students on how do we kind of regulate those emotions, understand that they may feel bothered or upset about it, but what was really an appropriate response or reaction to that. So whenever we put any strategies in place, and I've only just kind of given you a few as we've kind of looked at the kind of the areas listed within the DSM, is we really want to look at strategies that are considered, we want to have brevity, clarity, variety, and structure. So with the brevity, we want to make sure that any of our strategies or routines, that we're keeping everything of short duration, and we're able to incorporate breaks into them where we see fit. The clarity, we need to make sure that we're very crystal clear in all of our instructions, our expectations, the interactions. So what that requires us as teachers, it requires us to know exactly what we expect in every instance. And really we need to have that for every child when we're building our lesson plans. And sometimes with some activities that might not be as easy as we think. And then the variety and structure kind of seems like I'm contradicting myself. But with variety, what I mean is change it up whenever is possible. And what I mean by what changes is looking at the presentation method or a review activity choice or an assessment type, but it's kind of changing it up within a structured routine going into the next ones. We maintain that predictability, we keep that consistency in an organized format, and we just change up some of the presentation methods. So for example, we have morning meeting every day. That's our structure, our routine. But some of the activities we might do within morning meeting might change based on the content. That's the variety piece. So we want to look at those executive functions that are in the bubbles here, and looking at when we look at lessons, activities, routines, or strategies, that do they meet at least 2 to 3 of these principal foundations? Are we including those? And in any strategy that you might have. So this is a very easy one. Again, this is just helping kids ground as we get ready for the day. Is something as simple as being at the door to greet your class as it begins. I know we're busy and we're on the phone and we need to check email and we're getting things ready for the class after that, or a meeting we have. But sometimes this really helps to kind of ground our kids in, getting ready for the start of that class or getting ready for the day. So it's something as simple as being at the classroom door as class begins, saying hello. The variety can be, again, we say a hello today, a high five tomorrow, maybe it's a fist bump. I know we've seen a lot of YouTube videos and Facebook clips of all sorts of things that teachers are doing with classroom greetings. But this is a great thing for students with ADHD, is having that personal connection to them, whether that be actually through a comment, question. It could be, hey, I know you had a baseball game this weekend. How did it go? So it's not meant to be lengthy, but it's just to have that personal connection and grounding. So with a strategy like this, it has the brevity there because it's not meant to be long. There's the variety opportunity there with the different type of greetings that you can provide. And it definitely provides a structure if we're doing it every single day. And I actually had a classroom teacher tell me that the one day she didn't do it, she kind of happened to be behind the 8 ball after being late from a meeting to get to her classroom. So she was trying to find something out, is her students waited outside the door. She kind of popped her head and kind of said, come on in, guys, hurry up, we need to get started. And the kids kind of stood out there waiting for her, going, but Ms. Miller, you greet us every day, and that's what we look for. That's how we start our day. And they didn't really know how to kind of get past that. So it was, again, it's something that you can do that really makes connections with all kids. So it's not something that you're doing just for students with ADHD, but it's definitely something that helps to support students with ADHD. This next one hits several of those executive functioning buckets, is looking at agendas and checklists. That could be checklists as far as instructions that are given. So we might give verbally, hey, this is what this activity is going to entail. This is what you need to do. And then maybe provide those broken steps down for a student to look for or to have on a sticky note or on their desk saying, hey, this is what you need to follow along, and that they can kind of just check that off as they complete everything that needs to be done for that activity or assignment. Agenda books are great. I know some schools that's a school-wide policy. If it's not, how can you encourage agenda books for your students with ADHD? Now, there's a lot of different ways that you can do that, whether it be an agenda book, or I know with technology, some have taken a picture of what needs to be done or accomplished as far as homework. They take a picture of what's written on the board, and that's what they do every class period, is they take it. So there's some different ways that you can go away from agenda books, but even think about what a great life skill that is for all. I live by my phone's calendar. That's where everything, if you want to know where I am at any point in the day, if you pull up my calendar, there is my agenda. That's kind of the schedule of what my day, my week looks like. So again, it's preparing them for that life skill of being able to do that later on. Sometimes we have some struggles with buy-in with older students of using agendas or checklists. And I just show them, this is how I've got to-do lists all over the place, where I've written things on stickies and I'm crossing things off as I've had that sense of accomplishment, which is nice to be able to cross those things off. So it's just how we are able to multitask and get through day-to-day routines. So it's not just a you thing. It's really kind of a getting them ready for adulthood kind of thing. So it allows us to have those explicit checklists for assignments. It helps us to develop personalized checklists if students need checklists for checking for common errors, checklists for directions or activities that they need to complete. So if we're looking at those principles, the brevity's there because you don't want checklists that are lengthy in description. The clarity's there, right? So we're going to be clear and concise in the steps as we've written them out. There's a variety of different ways that you can do this, right? Like I said, technology, it could be agenda books, it could be checklists. And then again, it provides that structure. So you've got all four of those principles being met. So here's just an example of a checklist agenda type thing. So this could be even what's written on the board as students are coming in. So they know what they're going to be accomplishing for the day or during that math period. This could also be utilized for sometimes some of our students finish a little bit too quickly with activities, and then they can be disruptive to others. So this is I'm finished, what should I do checklist. Now, I took this picture of this, but I probably would shorten it up in all honesty and just have some off to the side that I can rotate in, because the only problem I see with this particular checklist is that there's so many choices to choose from that sometimes our students spend too much time trying to figure out what they're going to do, that by the time they actually choose something, it's time to move on for the next activity anyway. So you might want to do just a selection of 2 or 3 for them to choose from. And then again, working with them on pacing. You have 30 seconds from your choice board or from your checklist here to choose what your activity is going to be while you're waiting for the next activity to start or you're waiting for others to finish. And then, like I said, you can change these up as weeks go on, or however you want to do it. The other thing I would avoid ever putting on a checklist as far as a finished checklist is computer time. Computer time sometimes is a great reward to be utilized, but not necessarily on a finished activity to be put on there, because what you don't want to reinforce is kids racing through or finishing way too fast of things and just to get to computer time, because computer time most of the time is a preferred activity. So you just have to be careful of how we're utilizing this, and also the fact that sometimes getting off the computer time can be a struggle as well. And you want this to be something that can be easily taken out, but easily also put away, so that way it's not interrupting flow into the next activity or the next subject area. Foldables and graphic organizers, again, some of these things are not new things. It's just seeing how they align to what your students' needs are that have been diagnosed with ADHD, but also some good classroom structures for many and all students. So if you're looking at foldables and graphic organizers, they're just organizational tools which help aid students in the task of, effortful task of note taking by giving them blanks rather than filling in or taking notes all by themselves. Again, it's kind of providing that scaffolding to get them there. Other things with like foldables that you can think of are like teaching students how to use 2-column notes. So if you look at Keys to Literacy, Joan Sededa's work, she does a lot with teaching students how to take notes. And I think that's a little bit of a lost art, but our students need that guidance and assistance, and then also how to utilize those notes after they've taken them. And that any of these things, graphic organizer, 2-column notes, foldables, can be utilized as a study tool. And what does that look like? So if we're looking at those foundational principles used, that again covers the clarity. There's not a lot of space in those graphic organizers and tools to take lengthy notes on those things. So the clarity is there. There's a variety of tools that are there. Though I preface that with there are a variety of tools out there, but you might want to only select a particular few that you utilize. Um, Sometimes we have so many tools to choose from that's just as problematic as having none at all. If we keep changing the tools all the time and using way too many tools, then the focus of the focus becomes the tool and not the content. And really, the purpose of utilizing graphic organizers and foldables and things like that is to help deliver the content or the meat in a meaningful way. It's not to focus on the format or the tool itself. It's just the vehicle in which we do that. But if the focus becomes so much on the tool itself, then we might have to think about, are we changing the tool up too much? So just something to think about. The tool's purpose is really to help reduce the cognitive load so that they can focus on the material. Brain breaks are important. It doesn't have to be something elaborate. It does have to be something that students can easily return back to their classroom activity or what's next. So just be careful that it doesn't become a 2 to 3 minute brain break, doesn't become a 5 to 10 minute or 15-minute brain interruption. So we have to play that balance with it. But what brain breaks really kind of help to do is, and we just need to make sure that we have some strong procedures in place, but they're meant to be short activities that engage the brain in different ways. So that could be through movement, it could be through song, music, games, something like that. You can Google brain breaks. Brain Gym has a lot of different little activities that you can do. Here's an example of one, just a move it, say it, just put this on the board and we go through these little steps and then we all sit down. But for any of you that are utilizing PBIS structures within your school, or even if you're not, just the importance of stressing explicitly teaching the expectations, just like you would with a classroom lesson or routines or beginning of the year when you kind of expectation and how to utilize the pencil sharpener and restroom procedures and all that. You're going to do the same thing with brain breaks. You're going to have to make sure that you've got the parameters for the activity, how kids are going to know when the brain break is over, how that they're going to transition quickly back to the lesson as soon as that's done, because you don't want something that's meant to be short to become lengthy and put you behind within your lessons. It's just meant to kind of give the brain a moment to kind of clear their head and then to get back into the instruction at hand. But these can be really, really helpful to incorporate in. If we're looking at brain breaks, again, the brevity is there because it's meant to be short. The clarity is very important, that we're there with the clarity of those instructions and those expectations, and how to utilize that is highly, highly important. The variety is there. Like I said, you can do all sorts of different things with music, with lyrics, with games, with movement. And then the structure is there as well. I've got teachers that utilize this. They know between math and science in the morning, it's very content heavy in the morning, and they just need a couple of those breaks. If you don't have something this elaborate that you want to do class-wide, it could be something as simple as that student taking a note, going with a peer and taking a note to the office and just getting out and stretching their legs, or walking to the end of the hallway and back. Things like that, just to get some movement and, again, just kind of freeing up brain space. Think pair shares have been along for quite some time. So this isn't anything new, but it's just an opportunity for class members to have a chance to think. We know processing can be difficult, so giving everybody that think time in step one, being able to think, so that way they do have something that they can share with their pair and kind of process through it. But it also gives them an opportunity, and it would have to be, again, teacher directed and supported, is getting them to be more accepting and working on those skills of being open-minded to others' opinions in a small pair setting before sharing it out with the group. So it's kind of working on it in that scaffolded model. But I think it's important to have that think part first, because oftentimes, again, we're still processing information as answers are already being shared out by others. So it gives us an opportunity to share our own acquired knowledge before coming into a paired and listening to the opinions of others and then sharing out as a group. So it kind of almost prepares them for collaborative work down the line. So again, we're looking at all those 4 principles being present there as well. Timers are great. Timers can help us to just kind of gauge the pacing. Again, it'll need some explicit instruction along with it. The only thing I note you with timers, there's not a whole lot of variety. That's probably the only principle that's not present in this one. But with timers, I know timers have gotten really fancy that you can pull up timers online that have characters that swim across the pool, and when they get to 5 minutes, there's all this animation to it, and those are awesome unless it becomes a distraction. If our students are so focused on which swimmer in which lane is gonna complete the race and not really actually getting the activity done, then we need a less fancy timer, right? So they've got silent timers, they have just the sand timers. We might have to just look at something that is a little less distracting. So keep that in mind with timers, but timers are a great tool too. When we're talking about organizational strategies, so the last one's good with pacing, but this one with organizational strategies with color can be really helpful, especially if we've got kids that are changing from classroom to classroom, or just, again, multiple subject areas that they're having to maintain. So we could say all of our science stuff, the science book is blue, so the science folder is blue, the science notebook is blue, so that way we have all of those things. I've even had students that we have used color code stickies that we have in the pocket of their folder for science, because we're working on not blurting out in class, that on their blue sticky notes that they just write any questions that they have, and then that way it's written down. Because oftentimes our students blurt out not because they're being rude or insensitive to others in the classroom. It's because if they don't say it right there on the spot, they're going to forget what their thought is. As quickly as it pops into their head, sometimes that's as quickly as it pops back out. So by having those sticky notes in their organized blue materials for science class, then any questions I have, I'm writing them, and then when the teacher asks for questions or it's my turn to respond, I can give a response that way and not forget, but still be contributing to class. So there's a lot of different ways that we can kind of color code things. Color code, like I said, equipment, how we turn things in, homework buckets that we can put up front, all of those kind of things. Also, along with color coding, is teaching kids how to highlight. And that's not highlighting the entire page. Sometimes if we don't explicitly teach kids how to do those things, it becomes they will highlight everything because everything's important, or you wouldn't have shared it with me. But then it's something that is everything's yellow, nothing pops off the page, and you can see it from space. So we don't want bright yellow pieces of paper with no purpose. So teaching kids how to highlight and do those kind of things. So again, that the color technique, the brevity isn't there per se when we're looking at the principles, but you do have the other 3 principles in place. So you have the clarity, you've got the variety, and you've got the structure there with this. But this is one that typically takes a little bit more time and involvement as far as the organizational or color coding or the highlighting and those kind of things. For students that struggle with maintaining, like they look at things as being very overwhelming. We've got this big project, we've got picking up a book in the library, despite it being on their reading level, can be extremely overwhelming. But they're looking at it. It could be something that's on their reading level and they can definitely tackle, but they look at it by sheer volume of what they have to tackle. It's just too much. So there's a technique called read to the clip. And you can just use 3 different colored paper clips, as you see in the book. Green is where they're starting for the day. Yellow is where they get a break. And this could even be an activity shared or a routine shared at home. That, okay, here's a break. whether you put the book down, get up, stretch your legs, get a snack if you're at home, whatnot. And all you have to do is then read to the red clips. So maybe you're looking at, again, growing sustainability of a task, and this is a great one reading wise. But if we start off with maybe 10 pages, and at page 5 is where the yellow clip is a break, and then we can kind of gradually grow that as they're able to sustain more and more time on task. But what it also helps to do is with self-esteem is when they see that if they can break it into chunks, but they can actually see how the chunks are broken, what they get is that sense of accomplishment at the end when they actually see that they can complete that entire book. But the book isn't as overwhelming because, again, we've broken it down into those small tasks. So you can also kind of do that not only with just like a read to the clip, but how are we chunking other assignments? So whether that be a math worksheet, just get to these 5, right? And you're covering up the rest of the worksheet. And we just unfold each row as we go along, or do it in rows of 2. So that way they don't see it as such an overwhelming, unachievable task, that we're breaking it into chunks, that it's more manageable for them. So again, that looks at all of those. We're helping with that. It's something that can be quickly put in place, so that brevity is there. It provides them clarity of, there's just clear set of directions that they need to follow along with that. The variety is there, and definitely the structure is there. And then you've got these last 2. So you've got mnemonic strategies, which I mentioned earlier. This can be a great way, especially if students are involved in making up the mnemonics, because the buy-in's there, and sometimes those odd things that they use, they just remember them. I've got kids who could remember, they've made up their own order of operations, and they could remember it. It was just weird enough that it just kind of sticks in your mind. But it's really just a way for them to help remember information. So tons of them out there. Right? And again, all 4 of those foundational principles are represented. And then lastly, Post-it notes and sticky notes. And I'm a girl who loves me some sticky notes. They're my best friend. I use them for to-do lists. I use them for annotating text and different things. But again, it's something that has to be taught. We have to teach kids how to use them. Again, as I mentioned before, with color and variety, I also use them for students blurting out. So I used particular color stickies to align with particular content areas, because sometimes I've had kids that wrote down questions, didn't get to ask them in class, but it was still a very pertinent and relevant question. But then we couldn't figure out, well, what was this? Who were you asking a question to? Which teacher, which content area was this question directed to? And the student couldn't remember. So again, by having it color coded, then we knew, well, it was a math question. So we need to make sure that we bring this back to Mr. Smith and answer your question that way. So there's a whole lot that can be utilized with sticky notes. And again, the structure really isn't there, because there's a lot of different ways that we can utilize it, but the brevity, clarity, and the variety of ways that you can use sticky notes, but it might not be utilized every day throughout every routine or every structure. It just depends on how you're using it. Okay, so I know that's a lot. I could talk to you guys for forever and ever and ever when it comes to strategies and routines. And I know some of these, I'm not providing you anything that's earth-shatteringly new, but I think it's sometimes bringing what we have back to the surface, and knowing how to utilize it and why we're utilizing it. So that is it. These are the last couple slides, as you guys have printed them out, are just some resources that I had. So you can definitely look through any of those. Some of them are some websites, and others are just some book and reading materials that I've used over the years.
Well, Ms. Sinclair, thank you so much for this helpful presentation. I think you've provided our participants with a great deal of very useful information. And to our participants, I am bringing over our question and answer box now. So the question and answers are open, and we are looking forward to your questions. And Ms. Sinclair will answer them now if you want to start putting questions in. Just bringing our view over so that we can, again, if you can start adding your questions to us. One of the things we were wondering, you were talking earlier about assignment notebooks for students. Do you find that that is helpful for students? I have heard some of our former participants have mentioned those. And one of the things they say is they do send their children to school with assignment notebooks, and they are asking the teacher to sign it at the end of the day. Do you find that this is something that is helpful?
I do. And like I said, I think from earlier, when I first started teaching to now, I think there's different ways to do that. So if a paper agenda book works, and I've had teachers that, again, that they're doing the greeting at the door for the next class, switching out, that again, or being at the door as students are dismissing, that it's something that could be simply done by the teacher of just looking to make sure that students are accurately recording that. Because I think sometimes that happens if we don't have the check as the adult, as that external control, students might not have accurately written down what they needed from the board, or have written down something that they don't understand. So then I think some of the complication from the parent end is, well, they wrote it down in their agenda book, but they don't know. And I asked them what were they supposed to do for this. There's shoulder shrugging, or I don't know, or I don't know what this means. So I think having that check by the teacher out the door, just kind of a quick run through of is it written down correctly, and even if it just takes a moment to say, okay, so do you know what you're supposed to do here? Or, this means you need to bring home your math workbook, or whatever additional layer of structure needs to happen. But I think it's very helpful, because I think it's how we, again, as we're preparing them for life after school, those are all things that we still do in some way, whether it be to-do lists, or keeping things on our technology or a phone. So I think there's just multiple ways to do it, but it's just preparing them for being out in the real world.
Great, well, thank you. Well, our next question now comes from Megan, and she was wondering, does it seem like as an educator you are seeing more students who are dealing with executive function difficulties?
Yeah, I do. I think if we're looking at in classrooms today, I think we're looking at roughly like 3 to 5 students in a given classroom with, let's say, 30 that might have diagnoses of ADHD or even characteristics of ADHD. And so we see a lot of those executive functioning deficits, but also you see a lot of those executive functioning deficits in those that struggle with diagnoses of dyslexia. So I think executive functioning, is tied to many different things. So I think that we're seeing the need to really put a lot of structures in place than we might have needed in the past. And I think it just happens to be a word we're hearing a lot more frequently in education. It seems to be the buzzword of today.
All right, wonderful. Well, Kelly has a question you mentioned a moment ago about just building on what you mentioned a moment ago. Kelly's question is, do you have any suggested wording for use on an IEP form that'll help clarify accommodations, such as the assignment notebook, such as other needed accommodations? What are some words that...
So I want to make sure I'm understanding the question correctly.
When the IEP is being written, what are some phrases or wording to help make things specific for the teachers, for the parents, to make sure that needed accommodations are available?
Okay. So I think it's understanding, again, the type of ADHD that they're diagnosed with, whether it be the inattentive, the hyperactive, or even a combined subtype. But looking at those characteristics, which hopefully, from an IEP standpoint, the doctor has weighed in and provided input to the team of kind of what those deficit areas are. And then I think as far as wording goes, for the accommodations, I think it's just more about the specifications of how you're using those accommodations. So if you're putting in that they need multiple breaks, it's what does that look like and how is it going to be utilized? So the student will have a 2 to 3 minute break every 20 minutes or after every 2 passages to stand up and stretch and just clear their head prior to re-engaging and helping them to focus. So I think if you're utilizing terms, some of the terms even just within the PowerPoint, just looking at just putting in structures and routines to help regulate their behavior or help structure their environment or help them sustain focus. Because I think those are what's the purpose of putting that structure in place. So I think if you're always looking at the specifications and the purpose,
Okay, well, thank you.
that can
Well,
kind of assist your wording.
is,
I don't have an exact wording for you. I'm sorry.
well, that's okay. That's okay. Many times we're looking for the right words as though there are specific magical words, and there really aren't. It is making sure that that concept is clear in whatever language is most appropriate. Well, our next question now comes from Shanita, and she was wondering if teachers are being taught these techniques that you've discussed, or is this additional education, additional information that teachers can learn and can apply, but it's a voluntary education on the teacher's part? Is this something that they're being taught, or do they have to go find the information themselves?
Yeah, and I think that varies from place to place. I can't say in institutes of higher learning that I'm seeing ADHD being specifically addressed. I see things like such as teachers having to take, or as far as pre-service teachers taking a classroom management class, but that's very broad and addressing multiple needs. So I see a lot more of those kind of trainings happening in service-wise, and I think it just depends on the district or the county or state that you live in. So we do a lot of that training in our county just because we have a specific need. So it's training that I actually provide because not the strategies really aren't earth-shatteringly complex. I mean, it's a lot of things that we have done over the years as teachers or we have utilized, but sometimes we don't understand the impact of or how it aligns to particular disabilities or diagnoses. And sometimes I think what it does lack are just the explicitness of instruction in its use. So for example, going back to highlighting, are we specifically teaching kids how to highlight? Or if we're utilizing guided notes, are we just providing the guided notes, or are we actually spending the time to model that and explicitly teach what it is how do they follow along with guided notes? Are they just really truly listening for the word that's missing, or do they understand what the rest of the notes are doing and how we're utilizing that to scaffold them to get to 2-column notes eventually, and understanding the purpose of using these things. And I've done numerous parent trainings over the years and expressing the importance with parents of their students understanding their disability or their diagnoses, so that way we can have those conversations in a school setting of the purpose of the accommodations or the supports that we're putting in place. Why are we teaching you to utilize this? What is this going to help you do? So that way they're invested and are part of that learning process as well. So I can't say it's just, I think there is an importance to being taught how to utilize these or taught these strategies and how to teach them to teachers. I think it's just a matter of where your district is and what type of PD that they're offering.
Thank you. We are already in some overtime, so we're going to take 2 more questions. And the first of our last questions is coming from Alicia. And she's wondering if there are any computer programs or ways of blocking non-educational websites, content from computers, so that it's distracting for students, whether the students are using the computer at school or at home. How can the temptation, let us say, to go surf YouTube for a little while be blocked?
Yeah, and that's very real too. I see that happening a lot. I can't tell you what they are offhand, but I do know in our district that we do have blockers and that our technology facilitators help to install on our computers in our district. And the nice thing about some of the ones that they have chosen is that it can be teacher controlled. So as our students in our county have to log in by their own username and number. But then what the teacher can do is there are times where they can block certain things, but then they can unblock it to give them access to this if they were earn that as a reward or need it to access something that they're researching on or working on instructionally, so they can control what's blocked and what's not blocked. So I don't know in the schools that you're working at if you have a technology person that you can reach out to and ask that question, but I do know they exist and we do utilize them and they're very beneficial.
Great, thank you. We have discussed it in other Ask the Experts on some of the programs and websites that will block things. And if our participants want to take a look, some of our previous webinars on technology have discussed that. And we also had a question that I'm able to answer. I know several of our participants are asking where your slides are, and they are available underneath Ms. Sinclair's photo. And underneath the free resources, you'll see it says Ask the Expert Sinclair, and those are the slides from today. You can download those as a PDF. Our last question now comes from Sylvina, and she was wondering if to send our participants off for the day, if you have any tips on how to give tips for parents and for teachers for homework time to make it a better experience. Just a handful of things that can help families.
Yeah. So having a designated homework space and a designated homework time. So again, structure is important. And I know kids nowadays have tons going on extracurricular wise than we might have growing up. So I know they've got a lot to contend with. But if they can say, hey, school gets out at 3:30, it's good to give our kids a little bit of downtime. Get snack, stretch their legs, whatever they need to do. But then, yeah, having a designated homework space that is free from distractions. So in my house, homework time is done at the dining room table because it's free from the television. You can't see that. It's not distracting from anything going on outside. And then all my materials are there. And I think that's important to have all those materials in an area so that way we're avoiding the up and down, or I need paper, now I need a pencil, now I need to sharpen my pencil. And that just kind of drags out homework time. So I usually have a bin. I've got multiple pencils, I've got paper, graph paper calculators, anything that might be needed, all in, just a set of drawers or in a bin or however the parent wants to do it, but all homework type materials that anything that might be needed is all in one area to avoid the getting up and getting down. And then typically as a parent, to being able to sit down with your child and say, let's review what it is that you have for homework and prioritize what needs to be done. Because again, it's sometimes overwhelming, and then that impedes their ability to initiate and get started because they just don't know what to get started. So helping them learn to prioritize and talking your child through that, going, okay, we've got math, we have spelling words, and then we have a project that's due but not due for 2 weeks. So what needs to be done first? Well, we'll do the math because I like the math, and the math and spelling are both due tomorrow. So we'll start with the math because it's something I prefer. Then we'll do the spelling. And then with bigger tasks, how are we chunking those tasks to get it done by the due date? So that way we're not waiting to the last minute. But talking through that, and then also providing some pacing supports for our child during homework time. So this should take you roughly, and that might be conversations between teacher and parent as well, to how long do you think the math assignment should take? That way you can break that into chunks at home and monitor. So 10 minutes is what this should take. So in 5 minutes, I'm going to check in on you to see, you should be about here, halfway, when I come to check. So that way we're teaching kids how to pace themselves through homework, like hopefully we're teaching them to do that at school as well.
Well, thank you. And everyone, thank you for being with us. This has been a very helpful webinar. And I'd like to thank you, Ms. Sinclair, for your presentation and for your time in answering our participants' questions. To all of our participants, again, thank you very much for joining us. We know that you have choices in your information, and we're always glad to have you with us. To our viewers who are watching this later, we're glad that you're with us also. And you can find this and other videos at our YouTube site, and that is youtube.com/help4ADHD. And we know many educators and parents also have questions about technology and screen time when it comes to ADHD. Next month we are featuring Dr. Randy Coleman to discuss video games and screen time. You can sign up now at chad.org/ask-the-expert. And the information is there, and we would be happy to have you join us. In a moment, I will be bringing up our quick survey, and your answers help us to know how we're doing and to select topics and information that is helpful for our audience. Please take a moment to share your feedback with us. We value your input and your suggestions, and we do use them again to make tweaks to our program and to choose topics for our future webinars. So I would again like to thank Ms. Sinclair. I'm glad that you were able to join us. And I'm very glad that
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, wonderful. And thank you to our audience for joining us. As you know, we are a program of the CDC. This is just for our paperwork. Again, to our audience, this concludes our webinar. Ms. Sinclair, thank you very much, and we hope to have you join us again in the future.
Thank you.